Hello. I just got the thumbs up from IT to get started, so I get the pleasure of asking the Chancellor to please sit down. Good evening, everyone online and in the audience. Thank you for joining us in Southeast Alaska at the University of Alaska Southeast. My name is Eleanor Oidna. I am the event planner for the offices of the Chancellor and Provost. On behalf of Chancellor Rick Caulfield, it is my honor to welcome you to the Evening at Egan lecture series. Before I turn the mic over to UAS Professor Aaron Hood, is Dr. Hood here? Yes, oh, great. I'm going to give you a heads up on some upcoming events in October. As many in our community know, Evening at Egan lecture series weekly presentations are offered every fall semester on Fridays at 7 in the UAS Egan Library. They are free and open to the public. They are also live streamed on UAS Facebook and can be viewed on the UAS YouTube channel. Presentations are by professionals in their field, and the topics are very diverse. October is no exception. Next Friday, October 12th, Dr. Fred Woods, a professor at Brigham Young University, will be providing a presentation on a history of the Church of Latter-day Saints in Alaska from 1900 to the present. On Friday, October 19, University of Alaska Southeast Assistant Professor of Outdoor Studies, Forrest Wagner, will be presenting his research about Alaska and its unique big mountain tourism. You can pick up a schedule of the remaining semester lectures at the sign-in desk or online at uasalaska.edu and do a search for Evening at Egan. If you didn't sign in when you arrived, we would very much appreciate it if you would please sign our guest book when you leave. There will be a Q&A after the presentation so that everyone online and in the audience can hear your question. Please wait until I hand you a microphone. And if you decide to respond to the answer, please also wait for the mic. And finally, just a couple of housekeeping items. The library is obviously closed during the lecture, so please refrain from perusing the aisles. The emergency exit is behind you to your right, the elevator to your left, and for the restrooms at the elevator, go right and down the hall, and they will be on your left. Thank you. Enjoy your evening.
All right, well, thanks everyone for coming. My name is Aaron Hood, and I teach in the environmental science program here at UAS. It's my pleasure tonight to introduce Allison Bidlack. Allison has been director of the Alaska Coastal Rainforest Center since 2002. Prior to joining the ACRC, Allison was science coordinator for the EcoTrust Copper River program in Cordova. Allison's academic training is diverse, which I think has served her well. In her role as ACRC director, she has a master's degree in biology from UAF and a PhD in environmental science, policy, and management from UC Berkeley. And as someone who has worked closely with Allison for actually the whole time she's been here, I can say I think she's done a really fantastic job of building the ACRC into kind of a regional research hub, which was really the vision when we created the ACRC. As part of that, she's earned major grant awards from the National Science Foundation, Alaska Climate Science Center, and the U.S. Forest Service. And I think, to me, probably Allison's most impressive accomplishment is that she's been able to develop a really interdisciplinary research program that looks at how ecosystems function not only through different lenses that range from biology to hydrology to oceanography, but also the research coming out of the ACRC really addresses the relationships between temperate rainforest ecosystems and the people and communities that rely on them. And I think you'll see that in her talk tonight. And I think that's really a great thing for this region. All right, well, with that, please join me in welcoming Allison.
very kind. And I've only been here since 2012, so I haven't been there that long. You have been here, yeah. It's okay, you're getting old. Well, thank you very much for having me, and thank you for coming tonight. It's nice to see a lot of friends in the audience. Just a little bit about the ACRC. Aaron told you a little bit, but I am faculty in the environmental sciences here. However, my office is actually in the U.S. Forest Service Pacific Northwest Research Station Juneau Forestry Sciences Lab, and that's just down the path. It's the really beautiful yellow cedar building down the path. Many people seem to think that we are a nonprofit. We're not. We are part of the university. We're a research center housed here at UAS. And maybe people think we're a nonprofit because we have the word rainforest in our title. I don't know. So we do live in a rainforest, though. The North Pacific coastal temperate rainforest ranges from Kodiak Island there in the west, along a narrow band through south central and southeast Alaska, down through British Columbia, into Washington, Oregon, and Northern California. And like most or many coastal temperate rainforests, this is a glacially incised landscape. There's thousands of islands here and fjords, and we actually still have a lot of ice on the landscape in the form of glaciers and ice fields. It's also the largest remaining intact temperate rainforest in the world. So I'm going to tell you a couple things about this system. There's basically three important things for you to learn and take away from this evening. One is all about climate change. So like many Arctic and subarctic ecosystems, we are at the forefront of climate change. And for anybody that lives here, you know that the Mendenhall Glacier is receding very rapidly and has been for over 100 years. These are photographs from 1958 and 2001, and you can see the change just in that time. And in the time I've lived here, just in the 6 years I've lived in Juneau, I've seen a remarkable change in this glacier. So glaciers in south central and southeast Alaska are receding. They're losing mass at one of the highest rates in the world. And the change that we've seen over the last 100 years or so is going to be continuing into the future. The maps here show, the one on the, the left shows mean annual temperatures from 1961 to 1990 for our region. It's in Celsius, and you can see that, there's a lot of fairly cool temperatures. As we move into the future, into the right panel here is a business-as-usual climate model taking us to the 2080s, and you can see how much our region is expected to warm over those years. We're looking at maybe a 4 to 8 degrees Celsius change in annual temperature. That's insane. So change is continuing to happen, and it's not just temperature that's changing, it's precipitation as well. So this is the same kind of map. This is showing the proportion of precipitation that falls as snow versus the proportion that falls as rain. And so, from the 60s to the 90s, this was a snow-dominated ecosystem for the most part. As we move into the 2070s and 2080s, it's going to be a much more rain-dominated system. And that is going to have far-reaching impacts from stream hydrology to forest ecosystems and coastal processes. So that's the first thing to remember about the system, climate change. The second important thing to learn and to remember is it's all about carbon here in this system. Now, I know when I say carbon, people's eyes glaze over. Carbon's really, really cool, and we're going to talk a lot about carbon tonight. Carbon is the fourth most abundant element in the universe. We're all made of carbon. We're pumping enormous amounts of carbon out of the ground, and we're pumping it right back into the atmosphere. It's the currency that ecologists use to sort of track the movement of energy in ecosystems. And so it's a really important element for us to study. In this ecosystem in particular, it's very important. So if you guys remember your high school biology, trees and plants take up carbon from the atmosphere. They use them to build cellulose. They store them in their tissues. The forests here are world champions at doing this. So temperate rainforests store more carbon per unit area than any other forest ecosystem in the world. And the Southeast Alaska and British Columbia are no exception. So the only forests that store more carbon than we do are forests in Tasmania and Australia. This is reflected in the fact that both Chugach, Alaska, and Sealaska have entered the California carbon market. And they're doing this to increase the stock price for their shareholders while keeping trees on the ground. So we have enormous carbon stocks here above ground in living trees. Now, as with most ecosystems, actually, there's a lot of carbon stored in the ground as well, and Southeast Alaska is no exception. Here in Southeast Alaska, again, if you live here, you're familiar with the fact that there's water everywhere. Everywhere you go, there's muskegs, there's wetlands, there's bogs. And the interesting thing about these is if you dig into this, if you walked through that muskeg and dug into that ecosystem, you'd hit, you know, 1 meter, 2 meters, 3 meters, 4 meters of peat. And all peat is just plant matter that's been laid down over decades, over centuries, and has never decomposed. And it doesn't decompose because the ground is so wet that it's anaerobic, right? The microbes can't actually do anything. They can't break that organic material down. And so that peat is just full of carbon. And it's carbon dense. My ancestors in Scotland and Ireland burned peat in the winter to keep warm, right? It's just like charcoal. So we have an enormous amount of peat here because we have an enormous amount of wetlands. And in fact, our team has been looking at the amount of carbon that's stored in the ground here. And the number is 4.5 trillion kilograms of peat in the Pacific coastal temperate rainforest. Now that's like a ridiculously huge, meaningless number, right? But you combine that meaninglessly huge number with the amount of carbon stock that's stored in trees and vegetation above ground, and you have an even bigger number that's actually globally significant. So people that study global carbon models and global climate change are paying attention to what's going on here, because what's going on here is actually affecting the rest of the world. Okay. The third thing to know and remember about the system is it's all about water. Okay, we all know it rains and snows here a lot. And all that rain, most of it, once it hits the land, it runs off as runoff in streams and rivers and runs out to the ocean. There's twice as much runoff here in the PCTR as there is that's flowing out of the mouth of the Mississippi River. So twice as much is coming off of our landscape as is flowing into the Gulf of Mexico. But we're only covering half the area. All right, so we've got an enormous amount of rain. So we've got climate change, we've got carbon, and we've got rain. So I'm an ecologist, and so what I do is think about the linkages among all those components that I just talked about. I think about how all those components interact with each other, and how they're being changed, how processes are being changed by climate change. And what I'm hoping that you walk away from tonight is a little greater knowledge of how this ecosystem functions. And also just, I want you to be thinking about, you know, next time you go outside, think about all those processes at play all around you, that some are subtle, some are not so subtle, some are really tiny processes happening in the soil with microbes, some are really big processes, like big climate patterns. Those are happening all around you all the time, and they're affecting everything around us. They're affecting the water we drink, they're affecting our fisheries, they're affecting the trees that grow in the forest. So that is the framework in which we're working. And so I want to walk you through a little bit. So this is a Pacific storm. We get a lot of rain that comes in, hits the ground, right? It filters through all that peat. It picks up the carbon that's in the ground. It dissolves a lot of that carbon, and then it moves it out in streams and rivers. And you can see how brown some of this water is. Those are tannins and tannic acids in the water. It moves all that material out into the near shore and into the ocean. So I talked about how huge the carbon stocks are here, right? There's these trillions of kilograms of carbon in the soil. Well, the same is true for the amount of carbon we're moving. So per unit area, we're moving more carbon from the land to the water than almost anywhere else in the world. So it's all about carbon and it's all about water. So remember, twice the volume of the Mississippi River, all that water's flowing off this landscape, and it's helping move the Alaska Coastal Current. And so that current is moving water counterclockwise around the Gulf of Alaska, past the Aleutians, and even if you look way up in the left-hand side of the upper left-hand side, you can even see currents moving up into the Bering Sea. This is a photograph, satellite photograph from NASA, and what's really cool about this is you can actually see that interplay between land and sea here. So along the coast there, you see the sort of gray, cloudy, that's the glacial flour, the glacial sediment coming off the Bering and Juneau ice fields. And that sediment is bringing with it lots of iron and other nutrients from rocks that are being ground up by glaciers. And then it's kind of hard to see in the light, but I hope you can see it. Further down in the Gulf of Alaska, there's these big gyres, these big eddies, right? And what that's showing, that's actually phytoplankton. This is a picture of the spring bloom. This is in June. So those phytoplankton, these little unicellular organisms that are in the ocean, are using the warming summer temperatures. They're using all those nutrients, all that water, all that iron, all that carbon, and they're using it to grow. That's the base of the food chain here in the Gulf of Alaska. And the result of that amazingly productive food chain is this. So this is the Bristol Bay fishery. And the Bering Sea pollock fishery and the Bristol Bay salmon fishery are some of the largest fisheries in the world. And they are due in no small part to the productivity of the Gulf of Alaska and the nutrients that are coming off of our landscape here. So that's how I think about this space, this place. And it gets me really fired up. I think it's really interesting how this whole system is put together. We are helping to lead a research network composed of researchers from Alaska, British Columbia, Washington, Oregon, California, and beyond. There's hydrologists, there's oceanographers, there's forest ecologists, there's climate modelers. We're halfway through a 5-year National Science Foundation project to study this ecosystem. We've even got folks from Chile involved in this network because Patagonia is a very similar ecosystem. And so it's been really interesting to talk to them and compare the differences and the similarities amongst these ecosystems. So everything I've just told you about, again, that is kind of the lens through which I look at this ecosystem. And this group of people also does that. And what I'm going to do next is kind of move to giving you a description of some of the projects that we're actually working on. So we're linking, this I've talked so far about sort of linking land and sea, and now I'm going to talk about linking that then with our cultures and communities here in Southeast Alaska. So I'll start here in the terrestrial realm with forests, forest ecology, forest species, community composition. So earlier in the talk, I talked a little bit about this transition from a snow-dominated to a rain-dominated ecosystem. So we're in the middle of that transition right now, and that's having a huge effect on one of our iconic species here, that species being yellow cedar. Yellow cedar, the picture actually down in the lower left is a picture I took a couple years ago on Prince of Wales Island, and you can see there's some dead trees. It's a little bit hard to see. Some of them don't have any branches left at all. Those are older, they died longer ago. Some of the ones with some sort of scraggly branches left probably died just the season before I took this photograph. The map shows the distribution. So in green is the distribution of yellow cedar in the Pacific Northwest, and the red actually shows the area of mortality. In the Tongass National Forest alone, we've got about 500,000 acres of dead yellow cedar trees. And what's causing this is directly caused by climate change. So what's causing it is that yellow cedar are very shallowly rooted trees, and they tend to grow in wet, saturated soils. And what happens is that when we're moving from a snow-dominated to a rain-dominated system, we're getting smaller and smaller snowpacks in the winter. And it's a little bit counterintuitive, but that snow actually helps insulate the roots during the wintertime. And so what happens here is sometimes we get those late spring freeze events, and those trees have already sort of woken up for the spring and they're getting moving and everything, and when that hard freeze comes, their roots freeze, and that kills them. It can kill them within a season, or it can take a couple years before the tree actually kind of realizes that it's dead. So that loss of snowpack is having an immediate impact on this species. And you can see it in the photograph here. This is also on Prince of Wales Island. You get sort of these ghost trees or ghost forests around the island that are quite obvious. Some of the things we're working on are looking at the ecological impacts of this mortality event. So what happens to these stands after the yellow cedar die? In some cases, western hemlock moves in, and western hemlock is much less important both economically and culturally in this forest. We're also looking at the population genetics of the species across its distribution. So what is the genetic diversity like, and what does that say about its adaptability into the future? And we're also looking then at regeneration of young yellow cedar and young seedlings. But the project I really want to talk about today a little bit more in depth is the yellow cedar salvage project we have going on. So for the past 3 years or so, we have been working with the Forest Service and with loggers on Kupernof and Prince of Wales Islands. What we've done is we chose, along with the Forest Service, we chose some stands of dead yellow cedar that looked possibly appropriate for salvage logging. We worked with a local logger to log some trees. Every tree was flagged, and once it was cut down, it was written with a number. You can see that one's marked 21. All the trees were then shipped to local timber mills. And then the mill owners, this is James Stevens, he lives in Thorn Bay. The mill owners were allowed to do whatever they wanted with those trees. Make whatever you want. You can cut them up for firewood, you can make 2x4s with them, you can build, a hot tub, whatever you want to do, as long as you keep track of what you're doing. And so this is an example of a logbook from one of the loggers we're working with. They keep track. Up there on the very top it says tree number 28, log number 2. They keep track of what they're creating from it. In this case, he's creating 2x6s, 2x4s, 2x2s, how many board feet there are, what that timber is worth once it's been processed, and then he's also keeping track of his time. So how much time is he spending, and then how much fuel is he using. So we've had these loggers keep meticulous notes about what they're doing, and we're just wrapping this study up. We're starting to analyze all the data, and a couple interesting things are coming out. Number one, the Forest Service definitely underestimated the amount of timber that was available in these stands. And so there's sort of a common perception that a dead standing yellow cedar just isn't a valuable tree. It's gonna be rotten inside, it's just not worth cutting down. Well, the fact is that these guys are actually getting a lot of usable lumber out of these trees. So that's the one thing. The other cool thing is that they're actually making a living from it. They're making a profit off of this. It's not huge, but they are making a profit, even with the logging costs, the transportation costs, and even getting it to market. So it's been a really fun project. We're hoping to have the report written up, and hopefully I'll give another talk at some point in the spring or maybe the summer about the actual results of this project. This is just an example of some of the products that they're making. Beams and dimensional lumber, as I mentioned, fencing. I think one guy made some picnic tables. Some of them actually just used it for firewood and sold it for firewood. And then up here on the right is actually, this is from Tongass Forest Enterprises in Ketchikan, and they're making, those are oyster floats, actually. So they're using the cedar for oyster floats, so go figure. Okay, so moving on to freshwater ecosystems. So we're interested in freshwater, we're interested in stream chemistry, we're also interested in stream flow and hydrology, and how that's being impacted by changes in climate. So one of the really cool things about this ecosystem that we work in is that you have all these different systems right next to each other, right? There's a glacial stream that's right next to a clear water stream that's right next to a brown water stream. This is something that Aaron Hood and Jason Fellman have been studying, the chemistry of these different systems and how that chemistry changes over the seasons and how they're different from each other. So we've been continuing the work that they started many years ago. We have 6 streams here in the region that we monitor. We go out every week or every other week to take water samples to monitor for chemistry, changes in chemistry. We're also monitoring the stream flow over the year. So the cool thing about this is that we can get to a model that's similar to this. This is from my colleague Rick Edwards from several years ago. We can actually create a model for the amount of carbon that's coming off for every watershed in the system, okay? So what this is showing is in the yellow, the more yellow colors, the sort of more interior glacial systems, those are actually transporting less carbon out than the systems that are in dark brown that are on the outer coast. So those rainy, sort of low gradient, peaty wetland systems out on like Prince of Wales and Kupernoff Island, that's where all that carbon is coming out, that's where it's moving. So this was sort of a preliminary model that was created a couple years ago. We're actually creating a model that covers the entire PCTR. And so what this is gonna allow us to do is look at, well, where are those like carbon intensive watersheds? And what are the spots in the ocean where that carbon might affect? And so I'm gonna kind of get to that carbon and ocean thing in a little bit. So that's the chemistry piece. The other piece then is flow, so stream flow. This is a hydrograph from Montana Creek from the USGS. It's January to December. And Montana Creek is basically a rain-dominated system, and it's also a very flashy system. And what flashy means is that you get big changes in the amount of flow that's coming down this stream. And so for Montana Creek, in the middle there, you got sort of the flat bits with 2 big spikes. That's summertime flow, right? Like this summer, it hardly rained at all for weeks and weeks and weeks. And if you went down to Montana Creek, there wasn't much water in there at all. This isn't from this past year. This was a few years ago. And those 2 spikes in the middle are rain events, right? So rain comes, it flushes a lot of water out. then it dries up again, then rain comes again. So it's sort of flashy. And you're moving from a system that's, say, 20 cubic feet per second to a system that's more like 350 cubic feet per second. That's a pretty big change. It's not as big as the event that's earlier in the year, which was probably about March or April. I'd have to look at the data, but I'm guessing that big peak there is probably one of those spring storms we get where you get this warm air, it rains a ton, but the snow is still there, so you get this rain on snow event, and just all the water just like rushes off the land and into the stream. And so, again, you've got basically 2 orders of magnitude in difference. You go from, what was 100 cubic feet per second to almost 1,400 cubic feet per second, almost overnight. And that's a real challenge for engineers, right, that are trying to design for culverts or bridges or even people that have houses along the bank, because that kind of event can move a ton of sediment and a ton of water in a very short amount of time. So we're interested in this kind of dynamic, extreme events. We're also interested in looking at seasonal hydrographs over time and how those change. So back to the snow-dominated versus rain-dominated paradigm, right? So these are October to October water year hydrographs, and what they're showing, so on the left, that's a typical snow-dominated system. So you get pretty low flows in the fall, but then you get this big spike in stream flow in like April, May, and June, because that's when all your snow is melting, right? So you get this big spring freshet. That's very different than a rain-dominated system like Montana Creek, where your high flows are actually in the fall. So when we start getting these rain events like we're getting today, day after day after day, you're getting actually really high flow in those systems in the fall and much lower flow in the summer. So the thought is that these systems that are moving from snow-dominated to rain-dominated are going to start showing much different hydrographs over the coming decades. Again, that is a challenge then when you're talking about, how do we approach long-term projects, whether it's stream restoration for salmon, what does that do for salmon spawning timing, for the survival of eggs and fry in a system? Because these extreme events can be extreme droughts too. You can be talking about scouring events, or you can be talking about droughts. How do we plan for hydropower or drinking water systems over those kinds of time periods? How do we design bridges and culverts, knowing that our weather systems, our precipitation, and our hydrology are changing over the decades? So we have just embarked on a new project with the Alaska Department of Transportation, with the University of Alaska Fairbanks, the Forest Service, and the National Weather Service. And what we are doing is trying to create better models of precipitation into the future and better models of stream flow. And so this is an example of some of the things that we're starting to do. So this is, the climate models we have that move into the future are really, really coarse scale. They're based on global climate models. And so the one on the far left is a 75-kilometer global climate model. This is showing average precipitation for September, October, and November. And if you're a bridge engineer and you need some information in the Montana Creek watershed, for example, about what's going to happen, that map is not going to help you very much. It's just, there's no detail there, right? So what the modelers that we're working with at Fairbanks are trying to do is downscale that. So they've downscaled all of these global models to a 20-kilometer scale for the whole state already. So they've done the middle. Some folks in Colorado have taken it down to 4 kilometers. Our team is going to take it down to 1 kilometer. And so it's going to take the supercomputer up at Fairbanks to do that, and it's going to take several months to actually run that kind of a model. But what that's going to allow us to do is that we can take that to DOT, and they can be like, oh, we can actually use this, because now we know, we at least have an idea about what that variability in flow might look like, say, 30 years from now or 50 years from now. And so we can do a better job designing that new bridge over Montana Creek or whatever they're thinking about. Now, one of the things that we need for these models is we actually have to have actual data to sort of validate them, right? So we actually use data from USGS gauges, and we also use data from weather stations. Weather station data, particularly at high elevation here in Southeast Alaska, is few and far between. There are not many high elevation weather stations, therefore we don't actually know much at all about high elevation snowpack. So I'm going to put a plug in for this citizen science project, which just got started in Alaska a couple years ago. It's the Community Snow Observation Network, and this actually brings backcountry users into the sort of science fold. So folks that go backcountry skiing or snow machining can download an app on their phone They can go out into the wilderness with their avalanche probe, they can stick it in, they get a measure of snow depth, they plug it into the app, it gets uploaded to a database. And people are actually using that snow depth data to better parameterize these climate models that we are creating. And so I'm putting a plug in for this. We're gonna have an outreach event sometime later this fall or this winter. We're gonna bring somebody from the CSO network down and get people involved in this. So keep on the lookout for that to happen. All right, so moving downstream into the ocean, we've got a couple different projects going on that I'm gonna talk about. So one is, we've been working with the Sitka tribe of Alaska for the past couple years. The Sitka tribe is doing an amazing job right now of bringing tribal environmental coordinators from around Southeast Alaska together to monitor phytoplankton blooms and to collect shellfish samples. They have people going out every week or every other week collecting shellfish samples, sending them to the state-of-the-art lab in Sitka where they get run for toxicity. And then Sitka tribe puts out that information every couple days. I got a little ping in my email and they say, this is the announcement for this week. These are the sort of beaches that are hot. These are the beaches that are not hot. This is my postdoc, John Harley, there on the bottom. We got funding for John from NOAA about a year ago. And what John's doing is working with the Sitka tribe, taking their data and looking at the environmental drivers of harmful algal blooms. So looking at things like sea surface temperature, tidal flux, salinity, how all those things are working to drive these harmful algal blooms and PSP events. So he's only about 9 months into his postdoc, so stay tuned again for sort of further results on that one. All right, the second project has to do with ocean acidification. You all probably know that the ocean pulls in atmospheric carbon dioxide. And through a series of chemical reactions, what that carbon dioxide does is make the ocean water actually more acidic. It lowers the pH. And that's important because it makes it harder and harder for shell-forming organisms to actually form those shells. So little things like diatoms and pteropods that are sort of the base of the food chain have a really hard time forming. And things that we like to eat, like clams and, well, I don't like to eat clams, but you might like to eat clams. Crab, I like to eat crab, have a hard time forming their shells as well. This is actually a big problem down in Puget Sound. A lot of the oyster growers are actually having a hard time growing oysters right now because it's so acidic and the waters are so corrosive. The other problem we have in Alaska is that the chemistry of glacial water actually exacerbates ocean acidification. So in certain areas like Prince William Sound or Icy Bay, it's actually, you get these really strong corrosive events. And then back to this map, remember the carbon coming off the land? Well, that carbon, those are organic acids, right? Our streams here, if you look at those brown water streams, are really acidic. That's tannic acid, that's what you use to tan leather, okay? So those organic acids are coming off the land. Some of them are getting buried in sediments. Some of them are being incorporated into the food chain. Some of them are simply being absorbed into the water and actually changing ocean chemistry. So this is an issue in Alaska. Many of our coastal communities and coastal ecosystems are at some risk from ocean acidification. I guess just last year, Lisa Murkowski introduced this bill to study ocean acidification. And right now, the state is trying to get a mariculture industry going, right? So the governor has a whole mariculture task force. There's money being poured into kelp mariculture and new oyster farms. And so we looked at this and thought, well, we actually need more monitoring. We need to understand kind of what the spatial and temporal patterns are in our nearshore waters for acidification. And so a couple years ago, we hatched a kind of crazy idea to put instruments on one of the Alaska marine ferries. And so it took us 2 years to get it done, but last fall, it finally launched. We got instruments put on the Columbia, and that boat generally runs a regular route between Skagway and Bellingham. This is me with my collaborator Wiley Evans from the Hakai Institute. He was the one that actually installed all the instruments. And so we're standing down on the car deck of the Columbia. If you're ever on that boat, you can kind of slide all over there and check this stuff out. What these instruments do is they continuously pull in seawater. It runs through these instruments, and then they're logging salinity, temperature, dissolved oxygen, and CO2 concentrations in the water. And then that information is getting uploaded. We had a heck of a time getting the permits for this because the Coast Guard does not like it when you drill a hole in the hull of a 485-foot passenger vessel. But they let us do it. And thank God they did because, again, this is an amazing data set. So this is the track of the ferry going back and forth. And this is the information it's collecting continuously along this route. This is basically a metric for how corrosive the ocean water is. And so what you're seeing as it goes through the season, you're actually seeing that seasonal change happen. So as we get warmer waters in the spring and the summer and the phytoplankton blooming and more fresh water happening, fresh water coming into the system, you're actually getting a change in corrosivity. So the red, so any number below 1, so the dark red and gray colors are corrosive to shell-forming organisms. So you can see that in the winter months, most of the water here in Southeast Alaska is not good. That's not super surprising. Often northern waters are pretty corrosive in the wintertime. And so it's good news that it's getting a little bit better as you move towards the summer. What's really fascinating about this data set, and so this is the largest data set of its kind, is that now we can see not only those temporal patterns, which we kind of knew about, but we can see these really cool spatial patterns. And so if you look at there's sort of a band of red that's along the bottom of that graph there. That's the Strait of Georgia. So if you're an oyster farmer in the Strait of Georgia, you might as well just throw in the towel because it's never out of that non-corrosive band. There's other areas too. It looks like there's an area kind of just south of Petersburg that also looks like it's sort of always in that red zone. So this is the kind of information that oyster farmers need to know. You know, where are the places that might make sense? And for the first time now we can look at this and think about, well, what is causing these patterns? You know, is it glacial runoff? Is it freshwater output? Is it something to do with the coastal currents? So I just got this data set 2 days ago, so we are just now starting to dig into it. It's really fun, it's really exciting. And these instruments will stay on this ferry as long as we can keep the ferry going. On that note, being as elections are a month away, vote for candidates that are going to support our ferry system. The breaks in the data you see there are not because of our instruments. Our instruments are fine. It's because the Columbia was in dock because something was wrong with it. It had an engine fire or a thruster went out or whatever. Our boats are old. We need to maintain them. If you want good ferry service and you want good data, vote for candidates that will fund our ferry system. All right. So last but not least, I'm going to talk just a little bit about glaciers, our glacier landscape. Again, we've got rapidly melting glaciers here, and so a lot of the work we do is also around glaciers. So real quickly, we just got funded as of Monday for a new 5-year National Science Foundation EPSCoR project. This project has 2 components. One is in the boreal forest system looking at wildfires. The project here is on coastal margins and looking at the impact of glacial runoff on coastal oceanography and coastal marine food webs. So, like I said, we're just getting started on this, so stay tuned over the next 5 years. We'll be working really hard on this project. The other project that we're involved in with glaciers is this one that I'm sure you all know about. So that picture's of Christian Kienholz. He's a postdoc here at UAS. He works with our group at the Climate Adaptation Science Center. And Christian's been working this whole summer with USGS and the City and Borough of Juneau to develop a model for Suicide Basin to figure out how much water is actually in that basin and how much is going to drain. And the work that he's doing is actually transferable to other glacial outburst systems. There are several in the state where communities and systems are at risk. Christian's going to keep working with us over the next year or so. And I'll give a plug for him. He's actually giving a fireside chat this winter. So look for that when that's announced. It's going to be really cool. I've seen him give a talk, and it's fascinating. It's really cool what he does. He's got drones and all sorts of stuff. So with that, I am going to kind of wrap up our projects. I hope that I kind of gave you some idea of sort of how the system works, how it's all tied together, and why I really like to work here. I would like to say thanks to all the agencies and organizations that fund us, both just fund our operations, but also fund our projects. We couldn't do it without them. I'd also like to thank our collaborators, which are far too numerous to mention, but also just the staff and faculty and students at ACRC. I have the best job in Juneau because I work with fantastic people. And this is 2 of them. This is Molly Dwyer and Connor Johnson. They're both undergrads here at UAS, and they've been working with us for about 6 months, and they're awesome. So Before I end, the special treat I have for you guys is a movie. So we have been working all summer to create a movie to basically showcase this ecosystem and the work that we're doing. Thanks to Johnny, our filmmaker, who's in the audience with us tonight. He's been working really hard. We just got this, we just got the last sound editing, 2 hours ago. So this is not going to be the final cut of the movie, but it's close enough to show. So I am going to cut to that, and I'm going to make sure I've got the sound on. Oh no, no, that's not the movie. That's the lake. All right, audio-visual people. Yes. But everything else was on this screen. Oh dear. No. This just worked. I swear we tested this before we started. We did. All right. I'll try this again. Oh, yeah, because everything else is missing. Okay. Really disorienting. Okay.
Oh, honey, you're so strong, like chili powder in your arms. When you hold me in them, I never have a chance to get away.
When you look at this area from above, it has as much water as it has land. The coast here is endless. It's made up of thousands of islands and glacial fjords, forming over 50,000 miles of coastline, packed into a 2,500-mile stretch that reaches from southern Alaska down to the coast of Oregon. The Pacific coastal temperate rainforest is saturated with water. Some places here get up to 21 feet of rain every year. This cool, rainy climate fuels one of the most carbon-rich forests in the world. We use this carbon as a currency to learn how energy moves through the ecosystem. Water here moves the carbon rapidly from glaciers high up in the mountains, upland forests, and wetlands, down through streams and gorges and rivers out to the coastal ocean. It's a high energy and complex landscape. And it's an amazing place to study the processes linking land and sea because there's just so much water.
Oh, honey, you're so strong, like chili powder in your arms. When you hold me in them, I never have a chance to get away.
The rapid flow of energy across this narrow coast creates a bounty of life that has sustained people for thousands of years. Today, some of the world's most valuable fisheries are based here. And the natural beauty of this place draws in millions of visitors every year. But the climate here is changing. It's warming at a rate that's going to affect all aspects of life. Addressing a challenge of this magnitude requires looking at it from all angles. To do this, we've developed a network of scientists working across borders and across disciplines to understand the processes that power this great temperate rainforest and how those processes are changing. The changing climate signals an uncertain fate for this place and for our communities. Together, our network can build a comprehensive understanding of this complex ecosystem so that we can prepare for the future of the coast between.
That was narrated by Megan Benke, whose parents are in the audience. All right, so with that, I'm happy to take any of your questions. I'm gonna try to get this, well, it doesn't matter. Wow, stunned silence.
Question. Regarding the golden cedar and the economic development opportunities for rural communities, how do rural communities apply for that project?
Well, the project is just wrapping up. So we worked with, I think, 6 loggers and mill operators in various communities, Craig, Thorn Bay, Knockety, Cake, somewhere else. And we picked folks that we knew would take good data, honestly. And so now that that's wrapped up, I think then the next phase, I don't know if I'll be involved in any more research, but we're going to turn over that information to both the state. So the Division of Economic Development helped fund that project, as did the Forest Service. So we're going to turn over the information to them and say, here, look, this is the opportunity. These folks can make money out of it. I think what might need to happen is that, maybe the Forest Service needs to open up more small sales to small operators, I don't know. Or there needs to be sort of more effort put into sort of cruising the timber base, if you will, for these yellow cedar stands. It was interesting because when we were picking the stands, I was with a really seasoned logger, and we were walking through these stands, and he was like, there's nothing here. This just isn't good. Like, we just kept thinking, that stand's not gonna work, that's not gonna work. We were trying to find stands that would give us good information. And it's just been really interesting to see, even the stands that we thought were sort of poor and weren't gonna be great have worked out really well. So I think there's a lot of opportunity out there. Yeah, Franz.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great talk. I was just wondering about the ocean acidification work, and if you get really great spatial coverage, but the ferry is somewhat limited, and you have data gaps and all that. Mm-hmm. Is there in Southeast now, or do you guys have plans on working on sort of time series in certain locations so you get the full seasonal development? Because that's really key, I guess, to anybody who would want to put in an oyster farm. And it seems it would be fairly simple to put in some simple moorings or something.
Yeah, well, so there's a mooring in Sitka Sound. And then there's 2 instruments. There's an instrument also in Sitka and an instrument in Ketchikan. They're called percolators, and they can do continuous monitoring of seawater. So those 2 installations are going. And then the Sitka tribe is working with both tribal folks, as well as now they've tied in with some of the oyster growers. to take water samples. So it's not continuous, it's probably like every week. But yeah, those will be sort of time series at locations that are definitely tied to mariculture or subsistence activities. Yeah. We'd love to get the instrument on another ferry, but it was, I think the whole thing cost $250,000. So trying to do it on another boat is maybe prohibitive. Yeah, hey Dave.
I was just wondering about, you were talking about carbon going from the land kind of out to the sea, and I was wondering about the role of really small streams. Like basically what is the contribution of kind of larger rivers compared to the numerous small streams that we have here?
Yeah, that's a great question. So like per unit area, those small headwater streams probably move more carbon. Well, that's not true. Higher concentrations of carbon per unit area. The big river systems, like the big glacial systems, because they're moving so much water, they're actually moving a greater amount of carbon overall. But the small streams add up. They're proportionally moving more water and carbon than the larger systems. So that map I showed you of like the 10 big rivers, like the Columbia, the Fraser, the Stikine, proportionally those aren't moving as much water or materials as those thousands and thousands of actual rainforest watersheds. So it's, yeah.
Thanks.
Yeah, good question. Okay. I would not, so the question was, are the yellow cedar done for? And I would not say that they are. Yellow cedar, there's actually a lot of them around, and what's interesting is that you'll find, in some places where you'll find mature, sort of large yellow cedar dying, you'll get a different morph of the tree. You'll sort of get these sort of bushy yellow cedar that actually tend to, they don't really propagate by sexual means. They just layer out. They seem to have sort of a different life cycle, if you will. So in that sense, the species is probably going to be fine. It also has a very wide distribution. So what I just that map I showed you with that sort of donut hole of mortality in the middle, the cedar trees in the north and the cedar trees in the south are generally doing pretty fine, because it's too cold in the north. In the south, it's already warm enough that freezing risk is gone. And so the cedar trees on the edges of their distribution are actually doing fine. And so in a sense, the species is lucky because it has such a long latitudinal extent.
Are there other species that are reacting in the same way?
That's a good question. Do you know the answer to that, John? I'm not sure. I mean, here, I'm not sure.
I'm sorry, you'll have to repeat that.
There's been a little bit of evidence from what I've heard of mountain hemlock showing growth declines, but not mortality like yellow cedar. And then there are disease-related declines of other species from pathogens that might be doing better in a warmer or wetter world. But in terms of death due to low snow like yellow cedar, that's the only one.
Yeah. So pathogens and insects are starting to become a problem here. Nothing like on the Kenai Peninsula, for example, but it is probably on the horizon. And then, we're getting forest fires in British Columbia, which is somewhat unheard of, and on the Olympic Peninsula. And so it's unfortunately probably just a matter of time before those move north. There was another question up front.
Power? There we go. Yeah, the first lecturer that was here, Mr. Wibbles, I think it was, doing a lecture on climate change. Interesting, he showed a graph that showed that basically dryness is pushing northward and the moisture is getting concentrated in the Arctic regions. And his line between tan, which showed dry, and blue, which showed moisture, was pretty much right here at Juneau. And then, additionally, I understand we have the Coriolis effect. I understand the exchange of heat between the tropics and the Arctic are basically a vertical conveyor belt of moisture, but then the Earth turns, so it comes up, arcs over and up to us here, creating the rainforest. But he said that's slowed down also. So anyway, I kind of wonder, based on that graph and this change in moisture exchange and heat, if this isn't the end of the rainforest as we know it. You know, just right up here, the trim line on the glaciers have melted out. It seems like even this summer dramatically. So I just wonder what you thought about that.
Yeah, I'm not sure, and I'm not sure anybody knows yet what's going to happen to this specific place. I think there's sort of competing theories about that. I mean, some models make it, actually, if you run certain different climate models out, they show radically different results. And so that's where some of this uncertainty and what's happening is coming into play. Some of the models show actually increasing wetness, some show increasing dryness. And so, yeah, I don't know. I mean, it's possible. I think about it a lot. I mean, I have family that live in Seattle, and that's rainforest too, but it's different. There are different species down there, and of course they have really dry summers, dry, hot summers. They have fire, and I do think about, like, well, will this system look more like Seattle in another 50, 100 years? It's quite possible. Yeah. Mm-hmm. All right. Well, thanks for spending Friday night here. It was fun. It's fun to talk about.